Call Jackie Dean.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And speaking to the first reading of the Electronic Monitoring of Offenders legislation bill, this bill enjoys the support of the House, it seems, through to the first reading and into the committee stage. And having sat on the Law and Order Committee in the last term and a half of Parliament, I see this as another step in improving the criminal justice system. I share the concerns of the previous speaker around this not being the answer to keeping communities safe, and I know that David Clendon also raised the same issue, that while this is a step forward in terms of electronic monitoring, and I'll talk about that in a little while, I don't think it was ever intended to be the silver bullet, if you like, but I do believe that it is another step in the suite of legislative changes which have been through this Parliament and previous Parliaments in order to both make sure that prisoners are kept where they need to be and kept under control while completing their sentences, but also with the focus on keeping our communities safe. And if I think about the previous speaker did mention a victim of serious crime, and the member is absolutely right. It is, it is so hard to protect vulnerable people in our society. And if I go back a little bit and talk about our work around the Bail Amendment Bill, I won't stray too far from this bill, but the Bail Amendment Bill sought to make it safer for society when there were people out on bail for crimes for which they had been accused and then went on to commit further crime. And that's the nature of what we're dealing with, isn't it, is people who are committed to committing crimes at the expense of innocent victims. And I think around this House and around New Zealand there is certainly widespread support for additional measures to keep anybody in our society safe. I think back to the discussions we had in the Law and Order Committee in the last Parliament around electronic monitoring. We were making amendments to that bill, and it was the time prior to GPS technology. Really, it's a very new technology and is revolutionising the way we monitor prisoners and people out on intensive supervision. And the issues back then, only just a few years ago, were around electronic monitoring. The radius of it would be a round circle, and so you'd have an offender on home detention with electronic monitoring with wearing a bracelet or an anklet, and of course there would be a round field around them. That was the perimeter of the electronic monitoring, and in one or two cases they couldn't even go to the letterbox because that was on a square section, that was in the corner. And so now with GPS, this is another step forward in terms of what we can do to monitor people after, in this case, where the amendment is to the Sentencing Act and to the Parole Act, to allow offenders to be released on conditions, and that's from a prison sentence of 2 years or less. So we're talking about pretty serious offences, pretty serious offending, which require, or repeat offending, which require people to be sentenced to incarceration for a period of 2 years or less. But on the other hand, as another member, and I think it was one of the national members, did mention that eventually all prisoners, bar just a very few in the criminal justice system, will be returned to society. And long gone are the days where the term of imprisonment comes to an end and the door creaks open and the plastic bag with the belongings is given back to the person and the good wishes go with them, only to go out into society to re-offend because they cannot find their way and cannot find their feet. I hope that those days are long gone in New Zealand, and I know that successive ministers of justice, ministers of courts and ministers of corrections and police give an awful lot of time and have brought through legislative changes and changes within our prison system to make sure that these days prisoners do not simply come to the end of their sentence and be released back into the community with a high recidivist rate of reoffending. It is a serious issue which we have tackled quite consistently over the past 4 or 5 years to great success. The rate of reoffending is dropping in New Zealand, and that is something for which we should all be proud. Our working prisons, of course, are transitioning from places of incarceration and punishment to places where there is an opportunity actually to provide education, improvements in health. Many prisoners who end up in prisons all around New Zealand have poor oral health, have poor mental health, have low rates of literacy and numeracy. Those issues are being addressed in our prisons, increasingly so year on year, budget on budget. And further to that, the extent of training now being provided in prisons is growing again year on year and budget on budget. We now have, from my last recollection, I'm no longer on this committee, but at my last recollection, there were 4 working prisons in New Zealand, and the plan is over the next few years to increase that number so that all prisons in New Zealand are working prisons. Why? Well, the benefits are pretty obvious, aren't they? But the major benefits, I would say, is that, as we know, those prisoners are going to be returned to become our neighbours once again, and we give them the best chance of not reoffending, of finding their feet back in society where they may have never had, may never had a job or a permanent home or pride in themselves. A working prison can give the opportunity for those prisons to gain the skills that they need so that when they go back into society they can do so with the greatest chance of success. So this electronic monitoring of offenders, the legislation bill, as I said, catches up legislatively with modern technologies of GPS tracking. So what that will do is allow the prisoners to be tracked in real time. And our notes tell us, and I'm sure that when the committee meets to discuss this bill, I'm sure that those aspects of the deterrent effect will be pointed out. And again, I will be interested in this debate as it goes through the House and in the months to come when it gets returned for its second reading in committee stage. Several members have pointed out deficiencies in the bill. The New Zealand First member did, I think the Green member did. Well, I'm interested to see what those deficiencies are, because from what I can see of this bill on the face of it is a relatively simple, straightforward bill which takes into account the new technologies and the new applications of them where they were expressly forbidden to be used previously. So prisoners who released on conditions from a prison sentence of 2 years or less, or offenders serving a sentence of intensive supervision were expressly forbidden to go out using GPS. So it catches up with modern technology and modern practice and modern treatment of policing. So I'm unclear from the speeches of the members opposite just what they were referring to when they were talking about deficiencies in this bill. I think it's a good bill. I think it is another step in the way to addressing the issues of reoffending, addressing the issues of the number of wasted opportunities and wasted lives that we have in the New Zealand correction system. I too have visited a number of prisons in my time as Chair of Law and Order, and it is very heartening to see when you talk to a young man who's very busy, I think a bricklayer in I think it was Auckland, I think it was Mount Eden Prison, and a young man doing a bricklaying apprenticeship, which was going to be very useful. He wished to get away from his gang-affiliated friends, associates in the Auckland region. He wished to, in the future, move down to Christchurch and get a job constructing letterboxes for a start out of masonry. And this guy was looking forward to a future. And it is very inspiring to talk to people like that and to see that they, while they are paying their debt to our society, they're also looking forward to a better life for themselves. So, Mr Speaker, this is a good bill and I commend it to the House.
Thank you. The next call is a split call. Catherine Delahunty, 5 minutes.